Hello, everyone. To be part of this community and to connect to TESOL, you can visit TESOL.org. And as you have seen from these slides here, TESOL has 20 different interest sections. Speech, pronunciation, and listening, SPLIS, is one of these sections, and it has nearly 900 members now. And it contributes to current practice and research in this specific area. And the contributions of these leaders whose names are cited here are very valuable. And I would like to thank you all. My name is Pelin İlgin. I am the community manager. And today I will be your moderator for the webinar. And as you see here, SPLIS has a newsletter with the title of As We Speak. And it has two issues every year. It provides articles related to speech, pronunciation, and listening. Also, TESOL interest section webinars are recorded, and from this page, you can reach to the recorded versions of the webinars. And welcome everyone again. The presentation is about to begin, and this session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes. Please keep your micros muted during the presentation and turn off your web cameras. If you have a question or comment, enter it in the chat during the presentation, and your question will be addressed by the presenter at the end. If you are on a phone, you will be given an opportunity during the question and answer time to voice your questions and comments. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 2 business days after the live event. And I would like to welcome Suzanne Graham, and SPLIS interest section is very pleased to present this webinar titled The Good Teacher of Listening. Our speaker is from University of Reading, and we are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. And we can welcome to the program again, and I would like to remind you to keep your micros muted during the presentation and turn off your web cameras. Suzanne, let's get started then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully my PowerPoint slide is showing. Is that clear? Can everyone see that? Is that okay?
No.
Yes? No? Is it not showing?
For now, not.
No, okay, hang on. I don't know what's gone wrong there. Okay. Okay, let's try again. Sorry about this, everyone. We had that all set up. It doesn't seem to be working. Sorry about that. Not a good start. Let's try again. Let's try again. Okay, just a moment. Okay, let's try again. Okay, is that better?
Now we can see. Thank you.
Okay, all right, apologies for that. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to talk here today. So I'm going to be talking about the so-called good teacher of listening. I'll talk a little bit more about why I have some hesitation about that term a bit later on. But it's very much drawn from a chapter that I wrote with Denise Santos that's published fairly recently in a book entitled Lessons from Good Language Teachers. And that chapter and what I'm going to be talking about is based on a project that I did a few years back now, which really looked at listening pedagogy and the ways in which teachers conceptualize listening pedagogy and what we might learn from that. So to start off with, a bit of a confession, I don't research and teach in English language teaching. What I'm going to be talking about is teaching of languages that are not English, because in England, the foreign languages that we teach are generally French, German, and Spanish, but hopefully what I'm going to be saying will have relevance to teachers of all languages, including English language teaching as well. So in this presentation, I'm going to be starting off by talking a little bit about why teaching listening is challenging and generally is felt by teachers to be difficult to do in what van der Grift and Go call a principled way. It's recognized as being perhaps one of the most difficult skills for teachers to teach. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the characteristics of the good teacher of listening might be, although I probably say that I think it's actually quite hard to say what is good. Good is quite a subjective term, and so all the things that I'm going to be talking about in terms of good are my perspective, and there may be many other perspectives on what good actually means. I'm then going to talk in quite a bit of detail about a continuing professional development model that I designed and ran with Denise Santos, which was aimed to develop teachers' understanding of listening pedagogy and how that might be implemented in schools in England. And in particular, I'll be looking at the extent to which that CPD managed to change the beliefs and practices of one teacher. So it's very much a small case study, qualitative examination of the impact of CPD on one teacher, but with wider implications, I think, for teacher development in language teaching more generally. So I'm going to try and combine a focus on research and practice. So it's research about practice. So hopefully those two things will be combined in what I say. I've got some other slides that we can come back to at the end if we want further details about anything. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what good might mean in relation to the teaching of listening, or in relation to anything really. I think it's probably generally recognized that characteristics that are important for teachers to have relate not only to what they do in the classroom, but what they believe and know. And certainly in England, the context of my study, all teachers are expected to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of how pupils learn and how that impacts on teaching. So for me, when I'm thinking about good, I'm also interested in teachers' beliefs and knowledge as well as what they do. Very much being a good teacher is as much about knowing and understanding as doing, in my view. So if we think about what we might expect the good teacher of listening to know and understand, I guess the first thing would be for me that the understanding that listening is a very complex skill, that is an active skill rather than a passive one. And based on that, it is something that probably is not going to develop as much as it could do if we simply expose learners to spoken language or give them tasks or tests that ask them to comprehend questions. So to me, the knowledge that actually listening has to be taught in an active way is a very important characteristic of a good teacher of listening. Part of that knowledge about the complexity of listening would be an awareness to a certain extent about in the ways in which listening is complex. So there are different models of listening, such as the one by Anderson here, which talks about different phases of listening, perception, passing, and utilization of what we hear, and the way in which in that model, bottom-up linguistic knowledge and top-down non-linguistic knowledge come together and are both important things. So while I wouldn't expect a good teacher of listening to be able to refer to models such as those, I guess I would expect them to have some insight into the complexity of listening and how it draws upon and requires learners to bring together different sources of knowledge and for those to be used in a interactive, combined way. And really, following on from that, I would hope that a good teacher of listening would understand that in their teaching, attention to developing both bottom-up and top-down processing and strategy use in learners is important, and that their role might be to help learners to draw on those two sources in an orchestrated, interactive and flexible manner. Because some research, certainly mine and Van der Griff, suggests that those are the characteristics of listeners who perhaps progress more effectively and who are more effective listeners in certain ways. Then 3, we've said that, I believe that learners' listening skills don't necessarily or rarely develop on their own without input from the teacher. I'd also hope that teachers would know and understand that it's actually possible to teach learners how to be better listeners, so that improvement is teachable. And I would expect that to be a fundamental part of a good teacher of listening's understanding. And then finally, I'd like them to have insight into how metacognitive awareness in the development of listening skills can be helpful, and that by inviting and encouraging learners to talk about how they're listening, to explore that, to reflect on that, is also potentially helpful. So those are some of the things that I would hope a good teacher of listening would know and understand. And then in terms of practice, I would hope that they would be able to implement teaching strategies that draw on that knowledge and understanding and facilitate the development of the different skills and knowledge in learners that I've just outlined. Okay, so if we think a little bit about how teachers teach listening, what do we know about it? I'd have to say that actually we know relatively little. So it's quite common for people to refer to teachers allegedly taking what John Field calls a comprehension approach. So he uses that term in a number of publications, including this one here. And by that he means really teachers, rather than teaching listening as a skill, really just testing listening. So playing a recording, giving learners questions that test comprehension, checking whether those answers are right or wrong, and then moving on, rather than reflecting on why those answers are right or wrong, or what that indicates about learners' understanding and comprehension and listening proficiency. So we have actually relatively little empirical evidence that that is what teachers do, although that evidence is growing. And so we have studies in Japan, such as one by Siegel, one by me and Denise Santos in England and in Brazil. And those studies do suggest that actually the comprehension approach is quite a dominant one in those contexts, and that teachers do tend to focus on what I call here the product, so on whether learners have understood, whether they can answer questions correctly, rather than on the process of listening, rather than focusing on how learners are listening and how we might be able to help them to listen better. So, caveat, we don't have much evidence, but what evidence we have does suggest that that is an important way that teachers actually approach listening in the classroom. So that perhaps contrasts with what I might hope the good teacher of listening might be doing. Okay, so if we wanted to help teachers become good teachers of listening, how might we go about that? And I think for this, it's important to draw on principles of effective teacher development that are used across all different areas of the curriculum, and which articulate that successful continuing professional development is characterized by a number of different things. So based on learning needs of the teacher, it's sustained rather than one-off, it is very specific to what it's being learnt, classroom-based, is collaborative, and it draws on external expertise. And another expert in terms of teacher development, Cordingly, also emphasizes the importance of teachers understanding why the approaches they're being shown in CPD might be more or less effective. So that implies that in CPD for teachers, there is a role for research evidence and asking them to reflect and engage on research evidence. But importantly, I would say that such CPD does not present recipes to teachers to be applied in the classroom, but in the words of Rod Ellis, pedagogic principles. So principles that teachers can take as the basis of their pedagogy and on which they then adapt to their own particular context. Okay, so is it possible for CPD to actually change teachers and help them to grow as teachers? I think for that to happen, it's important that both beliefs and practice are influenced in some way by the CPD. But it's also important to note that any change is not linear. So simply by changing teachers' understanding or their beliefs about how something like listening should be taught is not necessarily nor automatically going to lead them to change their practice. So I think that's quite a widely held view in research, but I think it's an important one to bear in mind. And what I'm going to show a bit later on, I hope exemplifies how difficult it is to actually change both beliefs and practices in relation to listening. In terms of changing and helping teachers to grow, again, I would argue that there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that engagement with research is helpful, but particularly if that is in conjunction with teachers applying it and appraising it within their own teaching, so that they actually use knowledge as a form of inquiry and they explore through their own practice what the consequences of their beliefs, their knowledge about something, the consequences of those things on how they are teaching. So that might happen and can be facilitated by teachers working in collaboration with researchers in projects that allow teachers space to reflect and give them activities that enable them to step back from their own experiences. I think quite often as teachers, we're very much caught up in the everyday aspect of what we're doing, and often there's very little time to step back and critically reflect on what we've done, why we've done it, and what the impact of that might be. In that process, there might then be some kind of recursive interaction between changing teachers' beliefs, teachers observing what impact any alterations in their practice have on learners' outcomes, and experimenting. And all those things are then helped, I think, by having access to external information or support that helps the teachers to make sense of what's happening. So those are some fundamentals, I think, to think about if we want to kind of discover or research into how we might help learners and teachers by developing good teachers of listening. So let's move on to the main part of my talk, which is really about the study that the chapter in question is based on. So there are two parts to this, and the part one is based on empirical evidence that Denise Santos and I have gathered over the years about what teachers actually do believe and do in the context of listening pedagogy in our own particular context, which I said at the beginning was England. And so in the project that this study is based on, we were interested in exploring what teachers said their beliefs and knowledge were about listening comprehension as a skill, and what they said they did to teach listening, and what they actually did. So to investigate those questions, we gathered, first of all, questionnaire data from not a huge body of teachers, but from quite a wide number of schools in England. And in that questionnaire, we asked them what they thought the purpose of doing listening activities was in class, what they did when they did such activities and why, what they thought the key issues were relating to listening, how it should be taught, and what activities they themselves included. After that, we followed up that questionnaire by observing 24 lessons with 13 teachers in 9 schools, so roughly just over 2 lessons per teacher. And we also interviewed those teachers after the lessons, asking them about what we'd observed and also asking them about the questionnaire that they previously completed. So what did we find in that study? As I've already hinted at, that, well, first of all, most teachers agreed that the most important reason for conducting listening activities in class is to teach learners how to listen more effectively, which is a very positive comment, I would say. However, the rest of the questionnaire responses and the rest of the data suggested that there was very little going on, which I would call teaching learners how to listen more effectively. So there was a clash between teachers' stated beliefs that that was their intention and what they actually seemed to do in practice. And instead, what both the questionnaire and the observations suggested was that teachers followed quite a procedural approach, and most of their focus was on how to set up a listening activity, making sure learners completed the task correctly. Were they answering the questions fully? Were they writing their answers in the correct place? And there was little or no focus on developing any listening strategies, on focusing on bottom-up aspects of listening, such as how to segment speech more effectively. And feedback in particular was restricted to whether learners got the answers right or not. So very much a comprehension approach, as John Field actually argued. So we took that empirical evidence as the basis for a continuing professional development project, which is the second part of our project. So part 2 of the project was about how we can help teachers become good teachers of listening. So we invited all the teachers who'd responded to our initial questionnaire, plus their colleagues and other teachers we work with at Reading as part of our teacher education programs, to take part in CPD workshops. And 10 teachers overall participated in some way, either by attending workshops, viewing those workshops as videos, and or completing follow-up modules. So all the teachers we involved taught the 3 languages that are taught in England generally, and they were all in state-maintained high schools in England. Okay, and what I'm going to focus on today is one teacher in particular, because firstly, she completed all aspects of the intervention, the CPD, all the workshops, the follow-up modules. We had questionnaire data from her observations as well. And she was also fairly typical of the whole sample. So she taught in a mixed-sex school, learners aged 11 to 19. She had a medium level of experience. She was an L2 speaker of the language she taught, like most of our teachers. And like most of our teachers, she agreed strongly with this key statement: it is possible to teach learners how to listen more effectively. So let's just give a little bit of insight into what we did in our workshops with teachers. So we began by talking to them about what we believed effective listening might be and what classroom studies of learners suggests effective listening might look like. So we looked at studies of learners who are more or less successful at listening, and we invited teachers to draw comparisons with their own learners. Did their own learners do similar things? We also wanted teachers very much to try to get a perspective of how listening was for the learner themselves. And so one quite powerful way that we did that was to get teachers to analyze extracts from learners thinking aloud while they were listening. and those data were drawn from the publications that we shared with the teachers, because we believe, I mean, I very strongly believe as a researcher that it's quite difficult to, I think, to teach listening well unless you have insight into what learners are doing and thinking as they try to make sense of what they hear. We then raised teachers' awareness about principles for the teaching and learning of listening. So things that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, the need to explicitly develop listening as a skill in its own right, needing to attend to both bottom-up and top-down aspects, the value of metacognitive awareness, and what an instructional framework might look like for developing some of those aspects. We also spent quite a lot of time looking at textbooks and anonymized extracts from the observations that we'd done of teachers, and asked teachers to try to compare those things with what we talked about in items 1 and 3 here. So did textbook materials seem to actually teach listening, or were they just testing it? Did our observations show teachers teaching listening or asking comprehension questions? And then we followed up that with hands-on activities to help teachers to learn how to adapt existing listening materials from textbooks. And we also provided them with key points from our questionnaire findings as a summary. Okay, in modules, that was then followed up with readings, which were contextualized in relation to how teachers responded to our survey and what we'd observed in their classrooms. So, for example, a module on feedback, we asked teachers to read extracts from an article by Go and Type, which is about a study where feedback is given to young learners after listening activities, where they're invited to discuss the strategies they've used. And in that study, that was actually found to be really helpful for learners becoming better at listening and becoming more confident at listening. Our participant teachers were asked to write reflections on some of those readings. And we also gave them extracts as part of that from teachers' own lesson observations and questionnaire responses. So they had their own personalized kind of module version. So on this slide here, this is the graph we gave to our case study teacher, showing how her response to this questionnaire item about feedback contrasts with other teachers in our survey. So quite a lot of teachers said that they did advise learners how to deal with difficulties next time after listening activities, but our case study teacher, by contrast, said she never did that. Okay, so we wanted to show them how their own responses corresponded or not with what other teachers in our study had found. Okay, so other things about the modules, there were activities that asked participants to relate what research reveals about learners' approaches to listening to the participants' usual practices for listening. We gave them detailed suggestions for alternative approaches, and we invited them to try them out with their own learners. And at the end of each module, we asked teachers to reflect on what they'd learned, whether the new suggested approaches had worked with classes, what changes they needed, etc. And so just to give a very quick example of what we did with teachers. So in the workshop, we talked them through a framework of what research suggests effective listeners do in terms of strategies. So they might predict what they're going to hear, but they also very much look for evidence and check out those predictions. They don't just predict. And then how they bring lots of different sources of information together, how they're involved in self-questioning, and how they combine different strategies together in a very reflective and evaluative and active way. to help teachers in our study to understand the kind of active and very complex nature of listening. Then an example of what we did to help them evaluate and modify textbook materials. So we gave them, for example, here, a transcript from a textbook. This one's in French about someone who wins a competition, a trip to Senegal. And then we asked teachers to think about possible activities that the textbook might present to go with that transcript, to think about the aims and objectives of different textbook activities, what knowledge or skills they seem to be trying to develop, but what knowledge or skills they might also neglect. And so, for example, we presented a typical comprehension approach activity and a more strategies-focused lesson around the same listening passage. For the modules examples, so for example, in the first module, we began with awareness raising for the teacher to help them develop their insights into the problems that learners face while listening. And we did that by giving them a series of extracts from learner interviews about what learners say what listening is like for them. And we asked the teachers to reflect about what the quotation seems to suggest about learners' problems in listening, and whether the teacher thought their own learners had similar problems. So this learner here, lacking in confidence about listening, trying to keep up with what they're hearing, concentrating hard on small parts of what they're hearing, and then missing the next thing that comes up. And then I probably haven't got time to talk about this in detail, but for module 2, looking at prediction and verification, how we can help learners to be more effective in using prediction as a strategy, and how we might teach them how to do that. So beginning with an article where a learner does use a lot of prediction, but not very effectively, getting the teachers in our study to reflect on why that might not have been helpful, and then offering them suggestions about how they as a teacher might teach prediction and verification by modeling the process to their own classes. So suggested ways of doing that, and providing them with materials like sample checklists that learners could use in conjunction with class listening activities. Okay, so for our case study, let's talk about that in a bit more detail now. So for Maggie, we had, before the CPD, we had a questionnaire, 2 lesson observations and an interview. During the CPD, she wrote self-evaluations and reflections for the modules. And after the intervention, we observed her again and we interviewed her. And we used a checklist for our observations, and we asked her various questions about what we'd observed, what she believed about listening, what she'd written on her questionnaire, and why she'd done certain things, and what she thought effective listening was. Okay, so what did we find? So before the CPD, here are some key findings about Maggie's pre-intervention reported practice. So these are Maggie's responses to the first question on our questionnaire, where we asked teachers to say what they would typically do when they are doing a listening activity in class. What do they do? What do students do? And why? So here, I hope you can see that Maggie is quite focused on the kind of mechanics of the task. So to get the learners to turn to the right page, the right exercise, to get ready for it, to look at an example so that they know what to do. She points out what level of the national curriculum, that's the UK assessment system, the exercise represents, so that they know what level they're working at. And then she plays the recording twice with pauses, and she checks answers. And she says that that's to ensure all pupils had a fair chance to complete the task. In the interview, she justified, or she explained that she did that because she wanted to make sure that they've got the right page, the right exercise, they know what's coming up. And that's part of the preparation to make sure they do try and listen effectively. So for her, listening effectively is about going through the right steps for the activity. It's not really about understanding what's being said. In our observations prior to the CPD, we saw similar things. So on the one hand, there was some evidence of Maggie talking to learners after listening activities about things that might help them. So about how they might use the register of the recording to understand what is being said. So looking at clues from the formality of the speech to help. But on the other hand, there was evidence, quite a lot of evidence too, of her being quite focused on advising learners how to get the answers right. So focusing on the results, listening out for the nationality and the age. So focusing on just what they needed to have or to understand for the right answer. During the intervention, though, we began to see changes, and I think that particularly came in Maggie's responses to the modules. So we asked her to implement an activity to try to explore learners' difficulties with them, to actually talk to the learners about listening and how they might overcome them. So Maggie wrote in her reflection that learners reacted very positively to the fact that their scores on tasks were of secondary interest. And she noted that learners felt supported by that, and they benefited and were positive about having a dialogue about how best to listen, and that it didn't actually matter if they didn't get all the answers right. So we saw that as a change in her thinking about what her role as a teacher of listening might be. Also, growing awareness of potential shortcomings of how she dealt with feedback before, and reflecting on how in the past, learners would tell her that, for example, they'd got 7 out of 10 for an activity, but she wouldn't really know very much about that or from that about how well they'd actually been able to understand or why. She also commented quite often that it wasn't an easy process. Completing the modules made her brain ache and quite complicated. So we saw her going through quite a slow and painful process of changing her thinking about listening. We also saw in her module reflections a more critical approach to listening materials coming out. Really thinking hard about the instructions for the activity, thinking about what is this presupposing? What is this activity actually setting out to do? Does it actually do that? And really a shift in her attitudes towards listening and how she might have used listening activities previously, and that actually those exercises might not have been that helpful, really. So a much more questioning approach. So we see there the beginning of a shift in beliefs and understanding about listening. We also saw that in the interview at the end of the CPD. So this time when we asked her what effective listening was in her view, there was a shift away from getting the right answer and towards thinking about skill development. So effective listening, not just being about ticking all the boxes, getting all the right answers, but about broadening vocabulary, gaining in confidence, and perhaps importantly, to have accrued new skills of how to approach it next time. Increased confidence also, having tried something in a new way, getting over the fear of doing that and getting a positive result from learners, then having the confidence to try it again in other ways. What about practice though? Okay, so this we observed Maggie completing, teaching a lesson after module 4, and that module 4 had been very much on bottom-up listening skills. So key phonemes, speech segmentation, liaison in French. There's lots of elision and liaison in French. We did see that there was less emphasis on finding the right answer. However, there was very much a focus on covering, getting things done. So throughout the lesson, she modeled as many different aspects of French phonology as possible, liaison, elision patterns as possible, one after another, modeling, asking learners to repeat, copy down rules. So there was very much a reminiscence of her previous emphasis on task completion. At the end of the lesson, she said, we're almost at the end, we're doing really well, we're getting through all this. Very little discussion or reflection with the learners about how the knowledge she was presenting and practicing with them might actually help them get better at listening. So that the changes in practice were really much slighter than we'd hoped. And she herself commented that actually perhaps her own subject knowledge might be an inhibitor there, that she didn't really know very much about the liaison patterns that we were suggesting might be helpful for learners, needing to have a PowerPoint to copy it out, to work to that, to have the rules. So that perhaps was a barrier to her. But at the same time in the interview, she did actually show awareness that actually she might not have altogether managed to implement that in her practice, and that she possibly overplayed what she did in the lesson that we observed. So to conclude then, and to discuss those findings and what that might mean for us, I think it's very clear that becoming a good teacher of listening is not straightforward, and that changes to beliefs and practices don't follow in this simple linear sequence. However, by allowing Maggie to examine her own practice, and also I think critically what other teachers were doing, as well as reading about alternative approaches, gave Maggie a number of things, particularly greater awareness of other things and the ability to articulate what an alternative might look like, what that might mean theoretically, and how it might be helpful for pupils. And I think also perhaps the strongest thing that she got out of it was greater understanding that actually talking to learners about how to deal with listening activities is in itself helpful, plus some strategies for implementing that within her own practice. So not just telling her that that was important, but giving her concrete ways of doing that. The positive feedback that she got from learners, her reflection on that outcome, leading to her increased confidence, seemed to add further impetus to her changing. And again, I think that's an example of this recursive interaction I talked about before, changes in beliefs, observing learners' outcomes as a result of that experimentation, having access to external information and support from researchers, giving teachers the confidence to keep on trying with things. But for more complex aspects of listening, teacher subject knowledge perhaps needs more time to develop. And that's particularly if we want changes in practice to go with changes in beliefs. So to conclude, really just to reiterate that the changes in beliefs may not lead to changes in practice. And even if teachers' insights into themselves and students grow, they may still fall short in their practice of putting those into practice. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's probably the start of quite a long journey, because, you know, to reiterate that becoming a good teacher of listening is very complex, requiring lots of quite deep and complicated insights, looking at afresh of practices and materials that are quite embedded, and a readiness to experiment with new approaches. But I would say, based on our experience, that actually that can be helped by an approach to teacher development that encourages participants to reflect on their own work and on the work of other teachers, as well as on course materials, and how those things all relate to research evidence. Okay, so just to stop with one last thought, really limitations in future research. There's lots of limitations to what I've talked about. Just one teacher, fairly short intervention. We really need much longer interventions with more teachers in different contexts so that we get a much better understanding of how we can help teachers become good teachers of listening, and really what they believe already about what teaching listening means in their different context, how we can help teachers in a variety of different educational settings to develop their understanding of listening. So that's the end from me. Thank you for listening. I hope that wasn't too long and fast. Quite a lot to cover. So let's move to see if anyone's got any questions.
Suzanne, thank you very much for your perfect presentation. It was very informative, and I would like to thank for everybody participating to this webinar. And they have some participants. They have shared their questions from the chat box. I would like to read a lot the questions, and then we will.
Okay, that's okay. Do you want to go ahead? I can't see the chat too easily, so if you read them out, it's probably easier.
Okay. The first question is, how many teachers answered the questionnaire?
So, yeah.
10.
So we had 115 teachers from 46 schools. So not a huge sample, but quite a wide range of schools.
Right. The second question is about, right, how does a student do a think aloud as they are listening? When speaking aloud, how are they not missing what they should be listening to?
Okay, that's a really good question. And so the think aloud that we showed teachers was from a research project where the learner, they had a recording and they had control of the call recording, so they were able to pause the recording and articulate their understanding and their thinking at pauses. But you're right. I mean, listening is a very difficult skill to do think aloud with. I think that's one of the reasons why it's a skill that it's hard to actually research, because it's not visible. You know, to get insights into how learners are listening, it's quite difficult. So by asking them to think aloud, but by pausing, and it's not natural, I realize that, but it's one way of allowing them to verbalize their thought processes. And so that's how we did it, and that's what we gave teachers to look at.
Okay, thank you. The third question is, can you clarify the type of strategies teachers are being suggested to use?
Okay, so the listening strategies that we invited teachers to work with in, okay, if I go back to this slide here, that I went over the slides quite quickly, I realized that, but most of the things that, okay, so most of the strategies that we were inviting teachers to develop or help their learners to develop are kind of in the slides here. So first of all, predictions. So we know from the research that I've done with learners that learners actually do, before they start listening, they do actually predict quite a lot. So whether they've been taught by their teachers to do that or not, I'm not sure, but quite often they will look at the task that they've got to complete. They might predict what they're going to hear and what the answers might be. But one of the things that we noticed that was that the better listeners, as well as predicting, they also checked that those predictions actually were correct, whereas the less effective listeners just predicted and were led astray quite often by those predictions. So if they were told that they were going to listen to a passage about holidays, that might then persuade them that they'd heard something that actually they hadn't heard. Okay, and we also found that better learners thought quite broadly in terms of topics and themes that they were going to hear about, whereas the weaker listeners tended to fixate on individual words, thinking, okay, I'm going to hear this word. I'm sure I'm going to hear this word in this passage. And
Mhm.
quite often they said they did hear the word, even though it wasn't in there. So we gave teachers activities to help them show learners the process of predicting effectively, but actually checking out the predictions. What kinds of clues should they be listening out for to actually verify those, whether those predictions are correct or not?
Mhm.
So then also using background knowledge, how we kind of use the context of the passage, clues in the passage, to work out what might be being said if we don't understand all the words. And an essential part of that is to develop the metacognitive strategies that are in the box at the bottom of prompting learners to think all the way through about whether their interpretation makes sense. Does it fit the context of what they're hearing? Does it fit in with what I already know? So those were some of the main strategies that we included in the CPD, and we show teachers ways that they might develop those with their learners. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Suzanne, there are two more questions. One of them is, did you use visuals for predictions at all?
Visuals. Yes. Yes. So in one of the activities that we did with the teachers, I don't know if this is answering the question or if this is what the question means. So we did use visuals. So we used a textbook activity where learners were presented with visuals. And they had, I think their task was to choose the picture which best summed up what the passage was about. And so we used those pictures as a sort of stimulus for prediction. And then it was quite a good example, because then the text actually, it contradicted what might be common predictions. So it sort of illustrated how what you think you're going to hear quite often isn't what you actually hear. So we use visuals in that sense. I don't know if that's what the questioner meant.
Yes, thank you. The last question is here. How would you suggest teachers look for the formative aspects of listening? What do formative assessments for listening look like?
Well, I mean, formative assessment, I think is really, to me, I understand formative assessment to be rather, well, it might involve asking them comprehension questions, but it would also involve them writing down how they arrived at their answer. Okay, so why they put that answer, and for the teacher then to give feedback on, you know, whether they seem to be using strategies effectively. So if I try and give you a more concrete example. So as part of an earlier study, we asked learners to carry out listening activities as part of their normal out of school work. And we asked them to keep a reflection, a diary of the difficulties they were having, the strategies they were using, what they were going to do next to get better at listening. And we gave feedback on that. So I think for me, formative assessment is about involving learners in activities where their task is to reflect and comment on how they are listening, and the teacher gives feedback on that process. So the teacher may not give feedback on whether the answer is right or not to a comprehension question. It's on how the learner is going about it. I might possibly have an example of something. Let me just see. So if I think about, if I had, for example, if I gave learners this grid, this tick sheet, see if I can find it. Where is it? It's a long way back. This one. So this checklist. So for me, formative assessment would be to ask learners to carry out a listening activity and to use this checklist to tick what they'd actually done. And at the bottom, underline the above, you think which of the above strategies was the most helpful, and put a tick against the one you'll use again. If I took that sheet in from a learner where, you know, they seem to be ticking everything but not understanding very much, I'd want to talk to them about maybe they're not really applying the strategies as effectively as they might be. So to me, that would be a form of formative assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any more questions? If you have, could you please write down from the chat? If you don't have, we can conclude the webinar. It seems that there's no more question. Okay. Thanks everybody for participating, and thank you very much, Suzanne, for your great, very informative presentation. And
thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. We are about to conclude the webinar, and you may now disconnect. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.